next couple of days. The last section of our course is going to be looking at both historical and modern-day controversies in genetic research. Today what we are going to do is to cover the historical controversies. And I can tell you that 2 of your exam questions are going to be based on the material that we explore today. I'm then going to prep you for Thursday's lecture, which will be based entirely on a class discussion. So the material which we discuss in class is going to be the basis for another of your exam questions. There is really nothing in the readings that detail or describe what we are going to talk about, and that's why I want you to do a little prep work on your own ahead of time to make you familiar with some of the topics we are going to discuss. Doing all of this is essentially preparing for that last exam. Are there any questions before we get started? All right, so as I mentioned, you're going to have 2 short answer questions based on today's material, 1 long answer question based on Thursday's material, and that's going to be it for your last test. By the way, your second test should be, by the end of the week, I should have marks. All right, so in terms of understanding these historical controversies, we are going to be exploring 3 stories today. The first story is about the race to find the structure of DNA. Our second story is about the beginnings of what's been called the Human Genome Project. And our last story covers a very controversial science that was popularized in the early 20th century, a science called eugenics. So the first place we want to start then is with the race to find the structure of DNA. Now the reason why I call this the race to find the structure of DNA is because this is exactly what it was. Our story is not about the discovery of DNA. This took place beforehand. Our story really begins after World War II, when scientists and researchers became convinced that DNA was key to understanding all of life. And because so many of these scientists and researchers had spent so much of their time creating weapons of death and destruction, after World War II, you can imagine their great enthusiasm in terms of trying to uncover this answer about what life was all about. However, the reason why we call this a race is because this is exactly what it was. It was a race amongst scientists and researchers from all around the world to be the first to cross the finish line. And the reason why it was so important to cross the finish line first is because these scientists and researchers knew that if they did so, they would be extremely rewarded for their efforts. Their names would be in the history books, they would be given the professional and academic recognition, they would become superstars in the world of science. So understanding this is very important in understanding the story itself. And we also are going to explore within this story 2 particular ideas. The first touches upon the very important issue of gender and science, and the second touches upon the ethic and moral questions that were raised, for instance, in this race to cross the finish line first. Now, to understand then the major players involved in this race to find the structure of DNA, let me at least familiarize yourself with them, or at least their names. One of the individuals who we will talk about a little later on was a man by the name of Linus Pauling. Pauling was an American working in DNA research, and he is going to come and play a small but very important role in our story down the road. However, if we want to talk about the major protagonists and the major groups, there are 2 in particular I want you to focus on. The first group that we need to consider in this race to find the structure of DNA was the group of Maurice Wilkins and Rosalind Franklin, who were doing work at King's College London in hopes of uncovering this answer. Now, when we talk about this pairing of Wilkins and Franklin, I want you to understand here how important personality was, and in this case, personality conflicts. Right from the very beginning, for example, Wilkins and Franklin simply did not get along with each other. They never got along in large part because they had very different personalities. Wilkins was far more laid back. He didn't really sort of like to speak up. Rosalind Franklin was far more open, forthright. She spoke her mind. Wilkins often didn't like this. there was a lot of misconceptions between these two partners as well. For instance, when Rosalind Franklin came to work at King's College, she was under the assumption that she was going to be working in partnership with Wilkins. Wilkins, however, at the time, believed that Franklin was going to be more of his assistant. So again here, you had some conflict. These things have to be layered upon the fact that Rosalind Franklin was also, at the time, a female scientist working in what was a predominantly male environment. And here we have to understand the kinds of difficulties she would face at the time. For instance, at King's College, it was not uncommon, for instance, for there to be many male-only spaces, male-only dining rooms, male-only lounges, things that are very difficult for us to understand, but that were commonplace. As a result, one of the things I want you to consider is that Rosalind Franklin was often excluded from these very important social spaces. And we've talked about social spaces before. Social spaces, of course, being key areas where people can come together, talk to one another, and in this case, informally connect with each other, which is sometimes as important as the formal connections that take place in a laboratory setting, for example. Wilkins and Franklin's relationship was also strained in large part because they had very different ideas about what they wanted to do with their research. And here it is important to understand how they were trying to ascertain what DNA looked like at the time. Now, when Franklin came to King's College, she came as one of the very few experts in a field known as X-ray crystallography. X-ray crystallography was a highly specialized, highly technical field. It required, for example, many years to perfect. And at the time, Rosalind Franklin was one of the very few people in the world who was able to use these techniques very effectively. X-ray crystallography essentially involved taking these kinds of images of DNA structures, very blurred images, and then trying to figure out the structure from these kinds of photographs, so to speak, or images. Well, the big problem even here was that Rosalind Franklin, during her stay at King's College, had created two sets of photographs, the A set and the B set. And even here, Wilkins and Franklin simply couldn't get along. She wanted to focus on one set of images, he wanted to focus on the other. Another problem for Franklin was that sometimes she felt at King's College that she was treated more as a technician than as a scientist for the kind of work that she did. And of course, as we know, over time and over study, this makes a lot of sense, knowing the fact that technology has always been seen as subservient to science regardless. So there were lots of problems then for Wilkins and Franklin. Moving to nearby Cambridge University, you also had another group trying to find this structure of DNA. And of course, this is the group who will ultimately be given credit. The pairing of James Watson and Francis Crick. Now, Francis Crick originally came to Cambridge to get his PhD in physics, but over time, and after spending more time with Watson, he became very interested in this race to find the structure of DNA, and ultimately, they will form a partnership. Now, Crick and Watson's approach to trying to find the structure of DNA was very different from Wilkins and Franklin. What they were very interested in doing at this time, for example, was in creating what we call three-dimensional models. And that was the particular approach they took. However, since Crick was not necessarily an expert in the field when he started, Crick and Watson in many ways lagged behind other partnerships at the time. Now here, it's important to understand that because of their close proximity to one another, Watson and Crick became quite familiar with Wilkins and Franklin. They knew each other quite well. And in fact, Wilkins will become the best of friends with Watson and Crick over time. Franklin was friendly with these two researchers, but Wilkins, for instance, spent time with them outside of science. They spent time at the pub. Wilkins would often complain about Franklin to Watson and Crick. This is the kind of relationship that they had. And so, when Watson and Crick, for example, showed Wilkins and Franklin their first structure, it was actually Wilkins and Franklin who pointed out some very basic fundamental errors. So they were familiar with each other's work, they would sort of confer with one another, but that's essentially where the relationship ended. Now, as these two groups were attempting to find answers to this question of DNA, word will come out of the United States that Linus Pauling had in fact come up with the correct answer. And at the time, people basically thought this race was over, given Pauling's stellar reputation. However, as the research became more scrutinized, it was discovered that while Pauling was on the right track to finding the answer to the structure of DNA, he hadn't gotten the answer quite right as yet. What, however, was Pauling suggesting? At the time, he was suggesting the idea that DNA looks like a helix. Ultimately, as we know, the right answer will be a double helix. And the notion of a double helix, the best analogy, of course, is to picture two ladders intertwined together. That's the image that most people, for instance, are familiar with. So Pauling, then, is leading researchers onto the right path. Well, unfortunately, by this time, however, Wilkins and Franklin's relationship had deteriorated to the extent that she was now going to leave King's College. These two simply could not work together, and Franklin was going to leave to pursue other fields in areas like tobacco research. But here is where the ethical questions really come into play. And here is where I want you to think, for instance, about the rightness or wrongness of Maurice Wilkins' actions. Now remember, Rosalind Franklin, during her time at King's College, had created two images, or two different sets of images of DNA using X-ray crystallography. And she had really just finished studying one set of the images and had not gotten around to looking at the other. Well, this other set of images was something that Watson and Crick became very interested in seeing at the time. And what Wilkins did next, of course, was very questionable. Because what Wilkins did was to show Watson and Crick Rosalind Franklin's work, but they did not tell Franklin that they were, or he did not tell Franklin that he was doing so. In other words, they showed Franklin's work, or he showed Franklin's work to Watson and Crick without her permission. Now, coincidentally or not, just a short while later, Watson and Crick are going to come up with the correct structure of DNA. It was those two who first proposed the idea of a double helix. And in 1953, they published their findings in the very prestigious journal Nature. When Watson and Crick's findings were confirmed, they were given credit as the co-discoverers of DNA. About 10 years later, they're going to receive the Nobel Prize for their efforts. A Nobel Prize which they shared with Wilkins, but not with Franklin. At this time, in fact, Franklin had already passed away. She died very early on due to an early form of cancer in her life. But many historians have argued that even if Franklin had been alive at the time, she probably would have received little to no credit for her work. This is where issues, for instance, of gender, science, and ethics really come into play. And it's important to understand really the details of this story that follows. Now, when Watson and Crick, for example, were asked about the importance of Franklin's images to their work, for years they downplayed the importance. They suggested, for instance, that these images merely confirmed what they already knew, and that they were not instrumental in their findings. However, even historians today, and you'll read about this in one of your articles, historians today acknowledge that had Franklin got around to looking at this second set of her X-ray crystallography images, she would have been likely to actually see these images herself. So for years, there was a downplaying, for instance, of Franklin's work. It also did not help that when we look at this Nature issue, it was Watson and Crick's work that was published first, followed by work by Wilkins and Franklin, which made it seem, of course, that Wilkins and Franklin's work merely confirmed what Watson and Crick had already done, and not the other way around. Even with all of this, however, Franklin's ideas and her contributions to finding this structure of DNA were singularly downplayed in particular by Watson. To understand this, I want to bring your attention to the fact that following the discovery of the structure of DNA, Watson is going to end up publishing a book. He's going to end up publishing a book for the general public, which was called, for instance, The Double Helix. This was a book designed to get the everyday person, or give the everyday person, a better understanding of the process it took to make this discovery. And this small book, The Double Helix, will become the most widely read book about this particular discovery for decades to come. Well, here, I want you to listen to how exactly Rosalind Franklin was described by Watson. First and foremost, Watson never calls her Rosalind Franklin in the book. He spends the entire book calling her Rosie, which in itself is a bit of a downplay. But more importantly than that, listen to the exact words that Watson will use to describe Rosalind Franklin. He talked about Rosalind Franklin as a belligerent woman who could not keep her emotions under control and who did not know how to interpret her own data. He falsely described Franklin as Wilkins' assistant, who was incapable and unworthy of producing Nobel Prize caliber work. That was, of course, the image most people had of Rosalind Franklin. And that is why Rosalind Franklin's name, also aided by her death, was essentially erased from the history books for decades. It was only in the 1970s and 80s where feminist historians of science and technology began to clamor for more attention to be paid, for example, to Rosalind Franklin's work. In fact, I'm not sure if many of you saw this last Friday, but on Friday, Google Doodle's image was that of Rosalind Franklin. So if you go back, you'll actually see it. And it depicts, for example, how her name went missing from the story of the structure of DNA and the important role that she ultimately played in this discovery. Now, of course, there are other ethical and moral questions to be considered as well. Was it fair for Wilkins to show Franklin's images without her permission? Did they actually come up with this idea themselves? How important was it for them to acknowledge the research, which they failed to do for years to come? And how different is this kind of environment from the scientific world today, where acknowledging research is considered to be paramount to avoid issues of cheating and plagiarism? And yet, ironically, think of all of these things, and think of the fact that when we talk about the structure of DNA, it's been considered by most people as the most important scientific discovery of the 20th century. And the most important discovery of the 20th century, scientific, is one that is fraught with such controversy. It's a very interesting story, and it's one that I really want you to think about as the first of our historical controversies in genetic research. Are there any questions? Questions about Franklin, Wilkins, Watson, and Crick?
She died before or after before?
So she died before 1963 with the Nobel Prize. And historians today are still not quite sure what her reaction was to Watson and Crick. Some say that she was really bitter about what happened. Others say she was a real scientist at heart and she just simply didn't care. She had moved on to her next field of research. So there's really no telling what exactly Franklin's reaction was to this whole episode. Some say in some of the articles you'll read talk about the fact that she mentioned, well, you know, even with these images, they had to be proven first. And so she was really scientist first before anything else. The work she also did following was in tobacco and cancer research, and that actually plays a huge, she made huge contributions there as well. Other questions? Okay, so some things to consider then in our first story about the race to find the structure of DNA. Yes? Yes.
She didn't use her intuition as much, right? So she wouldn't really proclaim any studies unless she was 100% sure. Would that have anything to do with the fact that she was a female trying to make it in there in terms of not wanting to like not?
No, I totally understand what you're saying. She wanted to be sure right away, and she was, yeah.
Exactly.
Not in the case of Franklin, and it really has more to do with her overall personality. She was, as I said, a straight shooting scientist through and through. So she would have been very reluctant to believe anything without any physical evidence or data. And given the fact she was an X-ray crystallographer, where you have to have some hard images in your hand,
Right.
it makes perfect sense that's her essential beliefs. Okay, so this is your first story. The second story that I want you to think about talks about the beginnings of what we know today as the Human Genome Project. And you can think of this story as providing you with the background to our major class discussion on Thursday. Again, I want to stress to you, you should be coming to class on Thursday. The class discussion we're going to have is going to essentially be the basis for one of your exam questions. So knowing what's going on Thursday will go a long way. However, to get to Thursday, we need to understand the beginnings of the Human Genome Project, which is going to lead to so many of the controversies we will be exploring. Now, when we look at the Human Genome Project, we have to look at this chronologically. We know, for instance, that DNA had been discovered. We know that in the 1950s, the structure of DNA had been discovered. And for the next decade or so, the next question that scientists, of course, became very interested in pursuing was exactly how DNA could be manipulated and the techniques that could be used to manipulate DNA as a whole. So this is exactly where the research was heading for the next few years. And you can see, for example, that this will include groups led by people now, like Watson and Crick. Now, in any case, we want to fast forward our story to about 1973. Because by 1973, scientists are now, for the first time, able to finally manipulate DNA or cell structure. And the ability, for example, of engaging in this kind of genetic manipulation is important to consider, because not only was this about genetically manipulating human DNA, by the 1970s, there are possibilities now of genetically manipulating animal and plant DNA as well. In fact, some of the early techniques that will be developed as a result of this kind of research will include new techniques, for example, like genetic cloning. And it is why, as early as 1978, researchers were able to clone the first human hormone. Now, we'll talk about genetic cloning on Thursday, but in the case of Thursday, our discussion is going to take us far beyond cloning human hormones to the idea of cloning entire species, human, plant, and animal. So by the 1970s and early 1980s, the idea of formulating and perfecting these kinds of techniques was increasingly popular. And so too was the ever-growing idea of mapping the entire human genome. Around this time then, different groups are going to become more involved with the project. Many of these groups were led, of course, by scientists, including those like James Watson at the University of California. However, other institutions are also going to play a major role in this project. These will include American government institutions, like the National Institute of Health and the Environment, or Office of Health and Environmental Research, as well as the U.S. Department of Energy. Now, many of you might say, why in the world was the U.S. Department of Energy interested in this project of mapping the human genome? It doesn't necessarily make sense in terms of a connection. But here, we again have to think of the time period and circumstances. Not only was the U.S. Department of Energy an extremely powerful government organization, but at the time, in the late 80s, it was also an organization which was employing a high number of biologists. Why would biologists have been employed by the U.S. Department of Energy for so long, especially into the 60s and 70s and 80s? Think about the time period. What's the major thing happening in the 60s and 70s and early 80s? The Cold War. So why would the US Department of Energy be employing biologists? What kind of research?
For the effects of like radiation.
Exactly. They were studying things like radiation, what was going to happen to people in the event of a nuclear attack. There was, in fact, this connection. However, by the late 1980s, the Cold War is starting to die out, and all of a sudden you have all of these biologists on hand who are in need, essentially, of a new project. And the notion then of mapping the human genome gains popularity in large part as a result of this. And it's also why you start to see the US Department of Energy closely connected to this study. Now, at the time, when there was general discussion about mapping the human genome, the consideration, of course, was that in order to make this project a go, you would need to map over 3 billion base pairs with an average cost of about $10 a base at the time. Well, just these numbers alone should tell you exactly what the Human Genome Project is a clear example of. What would it be a clear example of? Or big science. It's a clear example of big science. And in terms of the Manhattan Project, there are many connections to be found. Because as scientists and researchers were attempting to gain money for the Human Genome Project, they actually attempted to call it the Manhattan Project of Biology. Why would they make this connection? Why call it the Manhattan Project of Biology? There are reasons they wanted to make this comparison.
Well, the Manhattan Project got a lot of funding.
So it got a lot of funding. What else?
It sort of changed the entire world. The idea of nuclear weapons and DNA would do the same.
So you would see, for example, this kind of research having a lasting legacy or impact on a worldwide basis. So you're talking about its importance. And there's also something far more basic and fundamental. The Manhattan Project worked. It was a successful big science project. They had invested billions of dollars into it, but ultimately they had yielded concrete results. So if you're asking for this much money, one of the things you want to do is to make sure that people know that they are going to produce similar concrete results. So this Manhattan Project of Biology really gets underway by the late 1980s, around 1988, when different international organizations will come together to form the Human Genome Organization. And this Human Genome Organization, a public group, starts the Human Genome Project around 1988. Initially, this was estimated to be a long-term big science project, about a 15-year project, where the average costs were estimated at about $200 million for the first 5 years alone. So clearly, again, we are talking about a project worth potentially billions of dollars. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the goals of the Human Genome Project, here you have some idea of what they were attempting to do. First and foremost, the Human Genome Project was about mapping and sequencing the entire genetic code of humans. And it involved 5 major factors. First, identify the 20 to 25,000 genes to be found in human DNA. Then determine the sequences of the 3 billion chemical base pairs. Store the information, improve the technology, and then finally use this in terms of transferring into the private sector. These were the main goals of the Human Genome Project. But even here, we have some ideas worth noting. For instance, from the very beginning, 3% of all funds went towards looking at the social, legal, and ethical implications of this work. Why was it important for them to put this kind of money into looking at these issues right from the very beginning? Think again of the Manhattan Project. What don't they want to do?
Use it as a weapon.
Well, not necessarily a weapon. Think, for example, of how the Manhattan Project unfolded. Well, maybe they want to start looking at these controversies not after everything happens, but even beforehand. With the Manhattan Project, after the bombs dropped, people had started having second thoughts. They started worrying about the ethics and legal and moral issues of dropping those bombs. Here, researchers knew that from the beginning, their work was going to generate controversy no matter what. And so they put a great deal of money into looking at these controversies well ahead of time, studying them so that they would know what to do if the situation were to arise. In fact, it is these very controversies we are going to be exploring together on Thursday. Now, one of the interesting things of the Human Genome Project is that it was actually a project which was largely successful because technological advancements will make it far cheaper to do than originally believed. For example, instead of costing $10 a base, by the time we get to the end of the Human Genome Project, it was only costing researchers 10 cents a base to map those 3 billion base pairs. And that meant that in 1999, you already had 1 billion of those base pairs sequenced. A rough draft of the map was completed in 2001, and a few years down the road, the entire map itself will be all but completed. Now, in understanding the Human Genome Project, another thing I want you to consider are issues, again, of management and control. And there are a couple of them here to consider. First and foremost, when the Human Genome Project began, remember the Human Genome Organization was a public institution doing public research with public funds. However, at the same time, many private businesses were doing similar research, trying to obtain similar answers. And of course, one of the major questions that was raised during this time was whether or not these private institutions, private businesses, should be allowed to patent their findings. Because if they did so, this might in fact hinder access to this information in the public domain. Well, the idea of patenting results from a study like the Human Genome Project became such a big issue that in the 1990s, when the Clinton government was leading the United States, they actually passed a law. And they passed a law prohibiting these companies from claiming patents on a lot of their research. Well, a lot of those companies who had gone into the field, betting on making tons of money from these patents, were essentially left out in the cold. But it doesn't mean that other companies were not allowed to patent different aspects of the findings of this project. And one of the things to consider, for instance, is that with the Human Genome Project, one of the biggest controversies that remains today is whether or not companies should actually have the right to patent genes. It's one of those technological controversy issues I gave to you. Now, first of all, a lot of people don't understand this idea. What makes it possible for a company to be allowed to patent a gene? Does anybody here know the answer?
The genes are isolated and sometimes also manipulated and changed slightly.
So it's not the gene itself which is patentable. It's the techniques and the processes that the company uses to extract information, which is considered unique enough to warrant a patent. So within the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years, one of the major questions has been, should companies have the right to patent genes? And many countries around the world, up until only really the last few years, were allowing patents on a number of different genes. Perhaps the most controversial one takes us into the United States, where one company was able to obtain the patent rights for a gene, which is a well-known detector of breast cancer. This company, for instance, was given the rights for this particular gene, which meant that many women who wanted to see whether or not they were susceptible to breast cancer were actually refused access to tests that came from other companies. They would have to go directly to this company to obtain a test, which was usually very expensive and out of their reach. Well, you can imagine the kind of controversy that has been generated from these types of actions. And it's why just some time ago, the United States Supreme Court has started to negate some of these earlier decisions about patenting genes and has actually overturned them. making it far more difficult for companies to engage in this process. So another area involving, for instance, ethical, moral, and legal questions that I want you to consider. Well, the last of our stories today takes us to a very controversial science, and I'll use that term loosely, that was popularized in the early 20th century, a science which we call eugenics. Our study of eugenics is a great study showing us again this concept of how science is rarely ever value-free, and how inherent prejudices and biases can play an important role in scientific research. In fact, when we look at the eugenics movement, we see a classic movement of science being used to justify, and in some cases enhance, gender and racial prejudice in society. Now, to understand the eugenics movement, we have to turn our attention and go back to Darwin's ideas of evolution, which had been talked about and discussed first in the late 19th century. Now, if you recall previous discussions, we talked about the major idea associated with Darwin's theory of evolution, the notion of survival of the fittest. Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest suggested that in nature, certain animals have a genetic advantage over others, a trait or characteristic which allows them to better adapt to their environment than other species. As a result of this, these animals, for instance, can usually survive in their given environment, even with the scarcity of food, and Darwin called this idea survival of the fittest. In this case, fittest being those who have this kind of genetic advantage. Well, over time, people became very interested in Darwin's theory of evolution and started to apply it to the social world. Hence, the advent of something called social evolution. The idea, for instance, of social evolution or social Darwinism will become very popular in the early 20th century. And social Darwinism really involved the idea of taking Darwin's notion of survival of the fittest and applying it to the human population. The analogy here, of course, was that just like animals in nature struggle to compete for scarce resources, the same thing can be said for the human population, which also struggles to compete for what often are scarce resources. And the idea, of course, here is that within the human population, certain individuals are going to have a genetic advantage over others, which is going to make them more likely to survive. Well, this idea is very important if we want to understand the notion of eugenics. Because in terms of a definition, the eugenics movement itself was all about this idea of figuring out methods and techniques to allow humans to control their own evolutionary process. It was the idea, for instance, of being entirely in control of the evolutionary process of the human population, where, of course, issues of reproduction become extremely important, especially the notion of using reproduction to obtain certain social goals. Simply put, the idea behind the eugenics movement was that if the human population could control the reproductive process and could get certain individuals to procreate as opposed to others, then over time, humans could control their own evolutionary process and create a better species down the road. That is why the eugenics movement was inherently based on two factors: negative eugenics and positive eugenics. Positive eugenics was about figuring out methods and techniques to get those considered genetically fit to procreate and to have as many children as possible, thereby improving the species, so to speak. In contrast, negative eugenics was all about trying to sort of account for, trying to figure out who were the most genetically unfit in society, and of course, preventing them from reproducing and thereby bringing down the population. Now, the eugenics movement, as I said, really started to gain in popularity in the early 20th century. And in 1904, an actual center for eugenics research was established in the US, a place called Cold Spring Harbor, which if you look up, it's still around, it's just doing different things. Now, there were many very influential people to be found within the eugenics movement during this time, including its first director, a man by the name of Charles Davenport. Now, when we look at someone like Charles Davenport, one of the things I want you to consider is that as a classic eugenicist, Charles Davenport and others like him were of the firm belief at the time that every aspect of the human condition was of course linked to genetics. Your personality, your looks, your likelihood for diseases. And of course, they also linked something else to genetics, something we're going to talk about for the rest of the class. And that is the notion of human intelligence. Those within the eugenics movement, for example, at the time, believed that intelligence was very much linked to one's genetic lineage. But of course, they didn't stop there, because they were also convinced at the time that different ethnic groups had different levels of intelligence because some were better or more genetically fit than others. And this idea, for example, was one way of justifying in many cases a lot of actions that were taken in places like the US, but in other parts of the world as well, which were very much based on things like racial segregation. For example, in the early 20th century, one of the major problems that the United States was trying to figure out at this time was their problem associated with immigration. Immigration was a huge debated topic, and there was a great deal of concern at the time that the US was in fact allowing too many foreigners into their country. This was especially true of those they considered to be less desirable, people coming from less desirable parts of the world. And one group in particular that was targeted by these eugenicists were individuals which came from the area of Eastern Europe. Many Eastern European immigrants coming into the United States were believed to be of lesser intelligence by those within the eugenics movement. And what they attempted to do next, of course, was to try to prove this idea by using so-called scientific methods. Well, what type of scientific method did these eugenicists use to prove their very warped ideas about intelligence? Well, of course, what they used at the time was the intelligence test, something I'm sure many of you are still quite familiar with. To understand the history of intelligence tests, better known to you as IQ tests, you would need to understand why they were first developed and how they sort of changed in terms of usage over time. The very first intelligence tests were actually developed by a French psychologist named Alfred Binet. Binet had originally created these first intelligence tests to be used on children with well-known developmental difficulties. But even at that time, he had suggested that these tests should never be used on adults or children of normal intelligence. They were just to be used on children with well-known delays to help them, for example, over time. However, by the time we get to the 20th century, many people had taken these original types of intelligence tests and turned them around completely, where they became commonly used amongst the general population to try to determine or ascertain levels of intelligence. So this was the primary method used by eugenicists to try to prove their theories of intelligence, which stated that certain ethnic groups were less intelligent than others. How then were they able to accomplish this? Well, many new immigrants coming into the United States usually landed in a very famous place called Ellis Island. And at Ellis Island, a lot of these eugenicists would stay there And as these new immigrants were coming or stepping out onto American soil for the first time, they would be given this intelligence test to take. Now first, I want you to think of the problems associated with giving these tests. Many of these immigrants, for instance, had spent months of their lives in these closed, cramped ships, with little to eat, with little to drink. Normally, a family could occupy, for instance, a family of 5 or 10 could occupy an entire cabin. These people were tired, they were cold, they were hungry, they were irritable, barely spoke any English. They step off a boat, and all of a sudden they're handed this intelligence test in English. Well, you can imagine the kind of results that were obtained at the time. By giving these intelligence tests to many of these new immigrants, some of the leading eugenicists at the time made the claim that their scientific tests showed that well over 80% of these individuals could be given the label of feeble-minded, a category, of course, of lesser intelligence. And for those of you who have ever called your friends idiots or morons, those are the other two labels used, for instance, to talk about people of lesser intelligence during this time. So, these tests, remember, and this is one of the most important things to understand about our story, these tests were considered legitimate science. There was really no question about their validity or about their use. And as a result, many of these eugenicists became expert witnesses during this time of the immigration question. They served and gave testimony to House committees and Congress. And as a result, their data was used, for example, to justify the idea that quotas should be put on certain immigrants coming from certain parts of the world, especially those, for instance, that were considered to be undesirable. At the time, the language essentially they used was that they feared a contamination of the species. And that was the kind of thinking that was quite predominant. Now, not only then did the eugenicists use this so-called science to help, for instance, justify these kinds of racially segregated quota laws, but they were also used in a number of different areas as well. For example, one of the things that was very commonplace in the US during this time, but in other parts of the world as well, was the notion or idea of sterilization. Those who were deemed to be the lowest scoring on these intelligence tests, remember, were thought to be genetically unfit to reproduce. It goes to negative eugenics. And therefore, this was seen as justification for engaging in techniques like sterilization. And we are talking about, of course, both forced as well as voluntary. Now, this concept of sterilization became quite popular in the United States. In 1931, 27 states had their own sterilization laws. By the time we get to 1941, well over 36,000 people had been sterilized. And remember, many of them were sterilized without their own knowledge. They had no clue what was going on. In the late 1920s, there was actually an attempt to take this to the United States Supreme Court. But ironically enough, the US Supreme Court ruled in favor of sterilization, claiming at the time that sterilization was just like vaccination and that there was no difference between the two. For those of you who are not familiar with the story in Canada, Canada also has a very bleak story of forced sterilization, especially, for instance, when we talk about the Aboriginal population, for instance, in many parts of the country. Other laws that were used or enacted and justified in large part on these ideas also included segregation laws pertaining to marriage. In the United States, another group that was targeted in terms of these so-called intelligence ideas were African Americans. And therefore, in the United States, there were actually laws that were instituted prohibiting the marriage of African Americans and Caucasians at one point. This again was based on so-called scientific beliefs, which were thought of at the time, which held that African Americans and Caucasians were actually different species entirely. These laws will stay in the books until well into the 1960s. So what then is going to ultimately bring about an end to the popularity of eugenics? Well, ironically, the end of popularity of the eugenics movement really begins, of course, with the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany in World War II. Hitler, of course, was very interested in these ideas pertaining to eugenics, and took it one step further when he came into power in Nazi Germany. Of course, Hitler's idea of creating the perfect Aryan race is the extreme form of eugenics, because in this case, he was not necessarily engaging in sterilization, it was about terminating entire groups within the population that were considered to be a threat. And when people started to see what was going on with Hitler, they became quite horrified, as you can imagine. And this is what's going to lead others to start to closely question and criticize those within the eugenics movement itself. Still, I want you to start having a better understanding of exactly the problems with these kinds of tests. And not just in terms of the circumstances in which they were given. Now, what you see in front of you is an actual example of part of an intelligence test which was given to U.S. soldiers in World War I. This test was given to them to determine whether or not a soldier was fit for promotion, and again was used to justify the fact that a disproportionate number of Caucasian soldiers were usually given promotions over soldiers from other ethnic groups at this time. Now, a number of different types of these tests were given. There was a multiple choice section, and what you can see here is a fill in the blank. But the idea, for example, of this type of intelligence test is what I want you to consider. Because as we go through this together, I want you to start understanding that these types of intelligence tests were rarely, if ever, about intelligence. They were usually more about determining one's socioeconomic status. So before we begin going through it together, a couple of things to keep in mind. First, most individuals who were given this test again were given these tests regardless of their education, often in very difficult circumstances. These tests took hours where there were little to no breaks, and little to no direction or instructions given even if something could not be understood. So, given the fact these tests were given in let's say 17 or 18, we live in 2013 today, let's see if you would do any better on these tests given what we know. So, just yell out what you think is missing as I go through each one. Number one.
Parts of faces.
So, specific.
Parts of the nose.
Number
arms.
two. Number three. Number four. It's not the hand, it's the spoon. The spoon is missing from this image. Keep in mind, it doesn't matter if you can't see the image properly, if it's blurry, that doesn't matter. The spoon was missing. The spoon had to be put in the person's hand. If it was put in the bowl, or if it was put on the table, it was considered a wrong answer. Number five. Guys on this side, you guys can start talking too. Chimney's missing. But again, think of socioeconomic status. If you, for instance, lived in a house structure where a chimney, for example, would be a regular feature, you would probably know what's missing. But say you lived in the city, where apartment dwellings were more common. You were not necessarily familiar with these types of houses. Maybe you know what a house looks like, but you're rarely, if ever, going to know what's actually missing. And so we need to consider these things as we go through each of these pictures. What's missing from 6? What's missing from 7? The filament is missing from 7, but again, think of circumstances. Electricity only really started to be used in a place like the US around the 1880s, 1890s, so it was a relatively recent thing. Most people still had probably never seen a light bulb, especially if they lived in the countryside. Electricity was often limited to those living in the cities or those of a higher socioeconomic status. I also want you to remember that we're talking about a time, go back to communications, where radio was first just developing, telephones were still relatively new, there was no such thing as televisions, no such things as computers, and definitely no such thing as the internet. People learned generally from books. The standard education was probably a level 4 or 5, and usually you knew things based on your circumstances. So if you had never seen a light bulb, how do you know exactly what's missing? Okay, 8.
Return address?
The stamp is missing. In those days, the return address was placed on the back of the envelope. 9. 10.
Follow-up?
I can tell you right now, none of you will get it. What's missing from 10 is a rivet right here. Hope you're keeping score. 11. The trigger's missing. 12.
Tail?
Tail. 13. Now again, say you live in the Midwest United States. You live on a farm. What was the likelihood, for example, that you've ever seen a crab before in your life? Probably not very likely at all. And yet again, you had to consider what's missing. 14. Shadow. 15 and 16 are interesting. First of all, what is 15? 15 is a bowling alley. So again, you're talking about an activity many new immigrants would have been very unfamiliar with. And in this case, what's missing? The ball has to be placed in the guy's hand. The ball placed anywhere else on the lanes would have been considered an incorrect answer. What's 16?
Seesaw.
16 is a tennis court. Although one student once said it looks remarkably like a mousetrap, which sort of does. What's missing? Well, again, think historically. What has tennis been considered? A sport for who? The wealthy and the rich, the elites in society. So many individuals would probably have never seen a tennis court in their life, let alone they know what's missing. 17. Silence.
Is there no arm?
Her little hand is missing.
Oh.
What's missing from 18? The big horn from the phonograph. So these were the earliest record players. And again, who's likely to have a record player in their house if it's a new technology? The wealthy and the rich, the elites. What's missing from 19?
The reflection of her arm.
Parts of her reflection. And what's missing from 20?
Oh, is that card?
Yep. The diamond. Now, we've just highlighted, for example, many of the problems with a test like this, and yet at the same time go back to what I said at the beginning of this story. These tests, like the other intelligence tests, were considered to be sources of legitimate scientific data. Nobody questioned them, nobody thought there was anything wrong with them, and they were used to promote and to justify racial and gender bias during this time. In fact, if you're interested in learning more about these kinds of tests and other methods of science that have been used historically to justify gender, racial, class discrimination, you should read a book by Stephen Jay Gould, and this is where this test has been found, a book by Stephen Jay Gould called The Mismeasure of Man, where he highlights, for example, how this type of data has been used historically, or how science has been used historically to justify this type of bias. Now, are there questions then about either our story of the Human Genome Project or this story of eugenics? A very important one, as I said, when again reconsidering this notion of science as a value-free and unbiased enterprise. All right, if there are no questions, what I intended to do today is to prepare you, as I said, for lecture on Thursday, and that means giving you a little bit of time to start to look into these topics which we are going to be examining together. This can be found in your document section, so you might want to print it out. And what we are going to be doing in class on Thursday is to explore 5 modern-day genetic research controversies, and then I'll also talk about 2 legal case studies to end things off. But for now, the 5 topics we're going to be looking at are as follows: mandatory genetic testing, the genetic testing of pregnant women, nature versus nurture, germline gene therapy, and genetic cloning. First, let me talk a little bit about each of these topics. One of the readings I've given you briefly mentions some of these topics. You might want to look at it, but a lot of this will just be done by doing a bit of outside research. You don't have to write anything down for our discussion. You're going to be doing all the writing in the discussion itself. But when I say about preparing for lecture, just become familiar with these ideas. So the first, mandatory genetic testing. Mandatory genetic testing is really about this idea, and it's twofold, of whether or not people should have the right, companies or insurance companies should have the right to access your genetic test results, and whether or not, for example, the idea of having a genetic test should be mandatory within a country itself. The second area is the genetic testing of pregnant women. So a woman who is pregnant undergoes a genetic test to determine whether or not the fetus is susceptible to a genetic trait or a particular genetic disease. Next, nature versus nurture. One of the most popular debates still out there today. Are people more a product of their genes, which is the nature side, or are they more a product of the nurture side of the debate, which is the environment? 4, germline gene therapy, which is about this idea of creating designer babies. It's involving techniques, for example, which we have today, where a fetus can be altered to remove, let's say, genes associated with a particular disease, or where you can actually alter genes in terms of particular characteristics. It's about this idea, many have said, of creating designer babies, altering hair color, altering eye color, etc. And finally, genetic cloning, moving away from the idea of cloning human hormones to cloning entire species, human, animal, and plant alike. Now, Thursday, I can tell you, will involve class discussion. It's going to be based entirely on class discussion. So if nobody talks, nobody's going to do well. I'm telling you that right now. And that means everybody is going to be encouraged to participate at some point. Doing this means understanding and preparing what's going on. So the way you're going to do this is as follows. Each of these topics, of course, is controversial. Some people are for them, some people are against them, just like you did for your controversy papers. And what I want you to do is to start figuring out which groups would be for an issue, which groups would be against, what kinds of arguments would they have. So for instance, in preparing for mandatory genetic testing, you might think to yourself, would insurance companies be in favor of it? Would they be against it? And what would their arguments be? Not all viewpoints are going to be connected to all of these arguments, so just think about the most important or the most relevant ones for each of the discussions. In addition, I expect you to know these following 3 terms when we come to class on Thursday. The first term, genetic determinism. Understand what it means. Same with the term genetic diversity. Understand the term and why it's important. And finally, what are slippery slope arguments? Now, in relation to these 5 topics, there are other things you might want to look into. First of all, you might want to look into recent legislation that's been passed in the US for the first topic, mandatory genetic testing. Canada doesn't have this type of legislation, but it deals with this very issue. So, tell me what that act is all about. Then, when we talk about nature versus nurture, I want you to read about our good friend James Watson, who's still alive, and who recently, as 2 or 3 years ago, made some very controversial statements on race and intelligence. We're not talking about 1940 or 1950, we're talking about 2010. Figure out what he said. So, coming to class prepared, I can tell you now, is preparing for the final exam. If you miss the class, you're pretty much going to be left out in the cold, because everything we discuss in class is going to be the basis for your exam question. So the more you talk, the more you'll be writing down, and the more you know. That's how it's going to go for Thursday. are there any questions about this particular, or these issues?
So we're skipping 6, I'm guessing, or?
Yeah, I'm not gonna go into 6, we just won't have enough time. All right, I decided to give you the rest of class to start looking into these topics. If you have a paper to give me and want to sign in, please do so now.